Hello there, my name's Brandon and welcome to part 2 of our 3-part series about creating illustrations from 3D models within Clip Studio Paint. In the previous video we covered the basics of 3D modeling using primitive shapes, and in this video we're going to take that result and create a pixel art illustration over top of it. So let's get to it. Alright, so you can see I've got my model built up on this layer here, and then I've got an empty layer above that for creating my illustration. I mentioned this last time, but with the model layer selected we're getting this nice high-res look at that object. And this is really useful when working on the modeling. And when I select my illustration layer now, we'll see the model display at the actual resolution of my canvas, which is only 500 by 300 pixels, since this is going to be a pixel art piece. Now, because it might be a bit difficult to see what we're drawing right on top of the model like this, I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer to about 40%, just so it's backed off enough to see my own lines. For the first round of pixel line work, I'm primarily using the dot pen, which is found here under the marker category of the pen tool. This one is simply a 1 pixel brush with hard edges, and that makes it a reliable go-to for pixel artwork. In this early phase, I'm just tracing a lot of the flat lines around the model by clicking and holding shift with the dot pen, and that's creating all these straight line connections. You can see that you get this little outline guide showing you where the line is going to be placed, which is quite useful, and I just continue working my way around the bike to get an initial trace using these lines. For circular pieces like these mirrors here, I'd flip over to the ellipse tool. And when using shape tools like this for pixel work, it's important to set the brush size to 1 pixel, and to ensure that the anti-aliasing is set to the hard edges option, so we get that crisp pixelated look. Often what happens too is that we'll end up with these over-connected pixel edges and curves, or even just for the line work in general, you can see quite a jagged appearance for a lot of these lines so far. And that's okay for now. A lot of this was just getting the main structure in place first, and then it's possible to go in and clean up that line work after. And one of the ways I like to clean up line work like this is by looking at the individual pixel segments that make up the line, and sometimes forcing it into an angle that the line looks like it's trying to be. So for example, what I mean by this is like this line along the front fork came out as being almost perfectly composed of 3 pixel units repeating all the way up. But sometimes it was interrupted by a periodic unit of only 2 pixels. So in this case, I'd opt to erase those bits out and sort of just work the line up into being composed exclusively of 3 pixel segments. Depending on how mismatched a line is, forcing the line like this can sometimes have a dramatic change on the angle, of course. So if I want to avoid that, sometimes I'll actually just erase the segments that don't match the rest. And this leaves a broken line that's composed of identical repeating units, but allows it to carry a different angle than what a perfect continuous line would get locked into. The other neat thing about erasing from a line like this is that it gives sort of a rough or sketchy quality to the line work. And I like to think of it as sort of like using a different line weight in a sense. We're kind of constrained by the fact that we can't really go below 1 pixel. So the options are to use a lighter color to kind of artificially thin out a line, or to chop it up like this so it looks lighter when viewed from a distance. And that latter idea is sort of the stylistic approach that I'm using for this piece. In working with the underlying model here, I found it quite useful to have left these grid lines enabled, because for things like the wheels, it really helped to have a point of reference for the sizing, especially when you consider the foreshortened perspective that's going on here. So even though the front and back tire are distorted through this view into 2 different sizes, I could look at these grid lines and kind of eyeball the units as a reference for where the same design detail should fall. You'll notice as well that I'm starting to introduce more black shadow to things too. Now, we were just talking about the idea of line weight, and while we can't truly go below 1 pixel, we can certainly go above it. And for a line work illustration like this, it adds a lot of interest to the design to have some variance in line weight. We can use solid patches of black or thicker lines to bring presence to certain areas, and this will be contrasted by lighter areas or places that have finer details and textures instead of these solid applications. This canvas size I've selected, by the way, the 500 by 300, was a bit of a random, larger kind of canvas size for me. Most of the time, I tend to work with sizes that are in the range of retro consoles, like anywhere from about 150 to 250 pixels or so. So depending on what your own preferences are for this kind of thing, you may be looking at this like, oh yeah, that looks about right, that's what I would use, or maybe even thinking like, maybe that's kind of a small space actually. But for me, this is actually kind of a larger, almost high-res area than I normally draw within. But the cool thing about this is that some of that jaggedness of the line work doesn't actually really end up being too noticeable once you're viewing it from a distance. And also I end up having a lot of breathing room to create these finer details here. Once again, because our limit of detail is dictated by the appearance of a single pixel on this space, when you have a sort of quote-unquote large canvas like this, that goes a long way for being able to create intricate details within the bike itself, and to have those details actually stand out as their own readable items. One of my favorite detail pieces were these little stickers applied to the side of the bike. And in a case like this where we have a small icon design that could actually be a really useful asset to repurpose in a future drawing, I just wanted to share how you can actually save little designs like this as their own material if you wanted to create your own library of these things. So to do this, we'll first isolate the design onto its own layer. Then with this layer highlighted, we'll open the material window and go up to the top and select Register Image as Material. You can also find this option by going to Edit, Register Material, Image. From here, we're able to give it a custom name. We can also choose the material folder it'll be saved within. And there are a few settings for how it'll behave as well, such as being able to resize it or make it into a tile. In this case, it's a singular sticker design, so I'll leave those unchecked. And if we hit OK, we can go find it within the material list. And now that design is able to be dropped into a scene whenever we want. So if I end up doing another pixel illustration in the future that could use a sticker like this, I've got my own library to pull from rather than having to design something from scratch every time. Alright, to finish off the first phase of this illustration, I decided to bring in some shading using a Dithering brush. This is a special brush pack that I grabbed for free from the Clip Studio Assets page, and it applies a series of different pixel patterns that give the effect of lighter or heavier shading. One of the most standard dithering patterns to use in pixel art is that 50% checkerboard look, and I went ahead and filled that into the tires just to make them a bit darker. For the rest of the bike, I applied different styles between about 10 and 30%, just to carry the idea of that texture across the piece. And I think it's got this interesting halftone look, almost like it's from a manga or a newspaper or something to that effect. So here's the finalized look for the line work, and this is looking pretty cool as is, but in the next video we'll finish out this series by adding some color and finishing touches to this. I want to give it a soft, painterly kind of look, and we'll talk about how to do that within the realm of a pixel art piece. So be on the lookout for that one, and in the meantime, thanks for watching.